Excellent insight
Hello.
into the mind of a cookbook writer. Um, Next up is a very, very special friend of mine. We met too many years ago, which then also then belies our age. But he was born in Kashmir, and he's been one of the largest proponents for ingredients out of India. If you follow his Instagram, you will see that he mines specific ingredients from the northern part of India and well, all throughout India as well, and he then puts that out into incredible menus. He's a wonderful cook, a wonderful person. Let us all welcome Prateek.
Before I start diving really deep into India, Indian food, its people, and different verticals today we'll dive deep upon. I just wanted to add what this was a beautiful conversation. Um, I come from Kashmir in early 1919s. We were displaced. It was sort of ethnic cleansing, and we became refugees in our own country. Um, One thing that our mother beautifully said, we moved to different parts of India. We're not allowed to go back to Kashmir. She was very strict on two things when we were not living in Kashmir. She said, to preserve your identity, there are only two things. One is your language, other is your food. So I think that really stuck, whatever you said. So um, Indian food, India. I think very interesting topic. I think we're very, even as Indian also, I'm also still scratching surface, honestly. I think I moved back to India. I was studying in America. I moved back to India in around 2012. And I really started discovering my own country. And till date, till today, I'm still discovering. I'm still sort of moving from point A to point B. But today I also want to talk about what makes Indian food Indian. What are the different verticals? I think it's very interesting to really take a small dive into the sort of history as well. What I strongly feel that idea of India itself is a very sort of misleading concept, and there is no singular food, custom, people, language that defines. We can go slow on the slides. That defines India. And when we talk about the grandeur and vastness of Indian food, for some reason we leave its food out of those conversations. And to truly understand the gravity of how diverse Indian food culture is, one really just needs to travel the country through road. And you'll see from north to south of India or east to west, everything changes. We can go back. Can I have the clicker? Sorry. Everything changes. If I travel to north, if I travel to south of India, I don't speak the language. The food is completely different. Um, oh, like this? Yeah. Sorry. Everything changes, and I feel the part of the reason is because, okay, the part of the reason is because this is what I feel three pillars that food culture is based on: migration, evolution, and necessity. And indeed, I think they're very important because today when we talk about Indian food, these are the pillars. And when we talk about migration, let me take like few examples to make you understand what it really means. Um, um, last year, I was dining at Noori, and Ivan served me an idli with fish, and we started chatting about idli. Because idli is something which is very popular, one of the main breakfast things that people eat in India, but it's not Indian. It came to South India in 7th or 12th centuries through Indonesia. So it is more Indonesian than Indian. That's how the recipe travels. That's how the Hinduism also traveled from India to Indonesia and vice versa. We take an example of the bread culture in Kashmir. The place which I was born, it was the northernmost part of India. I think we have the most Central Asian influence in Kashmir because of the migration that happened over years. Um, uh, the Kashmiri food identity also came here from Central Asia via the invasion of different rulers from Central Asia. The Turkish conqueror of what we today know as modern Uzbekistan. And over the time, the bread culture evolved into Kashmiri bread culture because we accepted that. We made that us, like, and today that's why we talk about Kashmiri bread culture, but in hindsight, it all came via migration. It all came via conquerors to this part of the land. Let's take an example, one more example, which is biryani. We all talk about biryani, but again, the biryani word comes from the Persian word, which means biryan, right? And it's possible that biryani originated from Persia, which is modern day Iran. An idea of cooking rice, meat, and aromatic spices together I feel, can't be credited to one singular food identity, right? That is sort of north. Let's talk about a little bit of a northeast. So northeast, if you see, Tibet is there, Mongol is there, Bhutan is there, Nepal is there, China is there. And Ladakh, which is situated on the edge of the Tibetan plateau in north, although Tibet and Ladakh share a very complicated geopolitical relationship, on a cultural level, they're very similar. They share a common history, religious heritage, and culture. And today we see, because of the migration from Tibet into India, we see there's a very prominent Ladakhi food culture. It can be dumplings, it is noodles, it is fermented vegetables eaten as is or eaten as a broth. But it came via Tibet. But today it is as Indian as a biryani. It is as Indian as a chicken curry. In Northeast, it's very interesting because, again, Tibet moved to North, and Northeast has a very strong sort of Chinese influence, where we see black beans getting fermented. We see silkworms as a part of the food culture. And it is also defined by the different tribes there. So the Indian tribal culture, the Indian tribal food, which we don't talk about because, that never got exported. And it's a very sort of interesting region in India because not only, when we talk about protein culture there, it is mostly the insects that we eat. It's mostly different kinds of meat, which for a lot of people it's not cool. People eat, lizards and everything which moves literally. But I feel the practice of anthropology or eating insects is another result of the migration from Southeast in Asia. In Nagaland, which is on the northeast part, silkworms is a delicacy and is enjoyed commonly as sort of potato chips that you would enjoy. And the idea of eating silkworms mostly came into India through migration from China, and where records of it are being eaten, it traces back to around 3,000 years. So, the point that I'm trying to make here is India as a concept, Indian food as a concept, one of the biggest pillars is migration, because it was a country which had abundance of a lot of things, and through conquerors, through traders, they didn't just conquer or trade it, they also got their food. Tomatoes and chilies, which are sort of quintessential part of now Indian food, didn't even existed at that point of time. One thing also which is very interesting, the other pillar, which I feel sort of also gets neglected a lot, it is necessity and survival. And if we let Indian food defined by just tandoori chickens and naans, then we might risk the assumption that everybody in India eats that way, which is absolutely not true. And here's why the problem is. Firstly, these dishes are only fraction of a percentage of what comprises Indian food. But more importantly, to assume that every Indian eats that way is not only ignorant, but for me it's dangerous. Everyone in India does not have access to those ingredients, those cuts of meats and those resources. And as this sociologist Apadu Rai brilliantly puts it, the moral, social, and medical implications of food are nowhere potent than in India, where caste, gender, and not eating together are as powerful as eating together. And I feel, especially in India and everywhere, food is and always will be very political. Um, it is impossible to talk about Indian food without talking about its politics. And on the margins, and to give you a small example, on the margins of Hindu society, there exists a small sub-community called Dalits, and they have a cuisine of its own. And it is a cuisine, it is a food culture which was born out of necessity, it was born out of oppression. And to give you a little more brief into that, that community called Dalits literally translate true broken people. And historically and till today, this community has been discriminated against, like, oppressions and brutal atrocities. And they're widely considered untouchables because of their menial of work involved in cleaning sewage by hands, disposing of carcasses, cremating corpses, and rendering them impure. They were denied access to basic human rights, including water, land, and food. And this inhumane system of oppression was enforced by the upper castes. And whenever an animal would be slaughtered, they would be given what was left behind, which was discarded cuts of meat, stomachs, intestine, blood, tongue, feet, and everything which was basically left behind. And all this led to a food culture which was born out of necessity, which was born out of just to survive, and that scarce access to food meant that nothing could go waste. And this started, now everybody started talking about it, because all these things, or offals, or blood, or working with offcuts of meat, has become cool. Right? But sometimes when we talk about those things, we always leave behind the stories, that where it existed and where it was born out of. When we talk about Indian culinary history, it has always left these stories behind. It has left its, because nobody wants to talk about it as well. But today, when we talk about Indian food, all these stories are very important, as is the story of a biryani or a chicken tikka masala. There's virtually no physical documentation of this food culture available right now. But now I feel also strongly that it's high time that these conversations are at forefront, no matter how uncomfortable they are. This is sort of, I just put a map together just to give you a perspective about where things migrated from, etc. But I feel one thing which I want to really stress upon is that unlearning the myth of Indian singular food identity is very crucial in the times that we live in. If we homogenize the food identity of a land so vast, we risk erasing a lot of stories that need to be at the forefront of our conversations about equality, about justice. And as a matter of principle, we refuse to let chicken tikka masala define the gravity of our food culture. Fried silkworms, which are eaten, are just as Indian as biryani is. Blood curry is just as Indian as naan is. Royal kitchens of the past and oppressive systems of the present are both equally Indian. And I strongly feel it's time for Indian food to really get its expansive definition that it deserves. So thank you so much.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions. Maybe we can put that up. So maybe we'll start with the first one. How is, your sorry, the first one's now flipped a little bit. Like, how would you then begin to think about organizing the categories of food that come out of the vastness of the Indian subcontinent in light of how diverse the cultures are, even within the sort of political country. Um, and they're essentially different kingdoms, right? If I can assume that. And
India was always different kingdoms, different tribes. So mostly tribes, and in those and different kingdoms which sort of governed the entire subcontinent. And they all had their own food culture, very different from one another. But through, as I said, through conquerors, through traders, it started changing. If you go back to history and read a history book about India, there are only two grains which are from the subcontinent, which was barley and buckwheat, which still exists. There was no rice, there was no wheat, and eventually rice came, wheat came, tomato came, chili came, and it start becoming a part of the Indian food culture that we know of today. Um, if we go down south, black pepper is one of the predominant spices that is grown and used there. But there's no concept of curry leaves when you go to north of India. There's no concept of curry leaves. We don't use black pepper there. They're completely different spices, completely different food culture. The flavors are different. The cuts that they used are different. The kind of meats that are used that are different. As I said, in Northeast, when you go in the vegetable market, you'll see dried rats, you'll see dried lizards, but that is the part of their food culture. And sometimes people get disgusted with the idea of people eating that, but maybe they don't understand, they don't know that there's a reason why people eat what they eat. So
yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating to think that that, or rather to deconstruct the idea that India is singular, and that there are so many facets and interesting stories that come out if you begin to know the culture and you begin to like understand the culture. And it's like many places, but with India, it's interesting because of the timeline that's involved in it being an older civilization, and also how large the physical space is. Yeah, so the next question I would probably ask is, how has the many experiences of your travels impacted you as a chef? Not only as a chef, but also as a human.
I feel, I mean, really, it opens your mind. And when I started traveling India, I think when I first started traveling India, I was surprised that I had no idea about my own country. I had no idea about different food cultures. There was a lot of ignorance that existed. But I feel as I still am traveling through and through, every time, there's a different surprise. Last few months, I've been traveling the entire Himalayan belt of India, which ranges from north to northeast. And I was surprised to see that there's a huge charcuterie culture which existed within the communities, right? So we make our own sausages. Either it can be a blood sausage or a different sausage. We stuff rice, meat, blood into intestines, smoke them, dehydrate them, and then just like use them in different forms. But also, when you sort of take a step back and see why they are doing it, it is basically survival, because northeast, the entire Himalayan belt, during winter time, it goes to up to -10, -12, right? So they do all these things to survive. So preservation comes into being, fermentation comes into being. So it's very fascinating. The more you travel within India, I feel, the more like, I mean, it just never ends. Every day there's something new which comes out.
I think that's super fascinating. And I think this other question is also very pertinent. After so much research, can you talk a little bit about what you think authentic and traditional means to you?
To be really, really honest, I had this conversation, but I feel there's nothing, the word authentic doesn't mean anything when you talk about Indian food culture. So my mother makes a mutton curry, so does someone else's, but it's completely different. So what is authentic and what is traditional? We broke down that, we talked about biryanis, we talked about idlis, we talked about samosa, all these things. But I mean, technically, what is authentic and what is traditional in that? They came via through someone, and Ivan puts it brilliantly, which is who owns what, honestly, right?
That's
Nothing.
true.
Who owns what in this entire food? Everything is, there's always a cross section, There's always a cross section right there.
Absolutely, I think that's really interesting. And maybe these two questions could be, um, would then be also quite pertinent to this, is that it has this impression, especially in Malaysia and in Singapore, you'll find that it's very carb heavy, or breads or
Because
rice.
that's what got exported, and I'll tell you why. Between Southeast Asia, the entire south of India, and the culture and the food, even religion, it all got transported to Southeast Asia. And the entire sort of north, not entire, but Punjab, transported to UK.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, they took their food, and and that's how chicken tikka got transported, butter chicken got transported, and the perception of Indian food in Europe is very different from perception of Indian food in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, but I think you're also looking at what you were talking about in terms of how the chicken tikka masala has become the identifiable dish of India around the world, because it was
Because
just
the
became
word,
this, huh?
yeah, it
Of London, yeah, yeah, chicken tikka masala, and how that it became a food export because of the migration that happened, and then which leads us to our last question. I think quite interesting would be, what are the top three lesser known regional dishes that you think the world needs to know about?
I had a very interesting dish, and you know what? I was talking about the foods of the Dalits, which was it's called rakt, which literally means blood curry. So blood gets coagulated. They put it in the fridge. They cut small cubes out of it, and they just toss it in mustard oil, mustard seeds, fresh chilies, and fresh ginger, and you eat it as a snack.
Wow,
So it's
it's like
literally
a
eating,
real
yeah, like a real
hyper
blood.
nutritious,
And,
dense snack.
and they also make fritters out of it. So they dunk it into a chickpea batter and just fry it and put it in this thing. So you're literally eating blood. But as I said, you cannot be talking about Indian food without talking the politics behind it. Because that food, which we'll start celebrating, I'm sure very soon, and everybody will start putting it on Instagram. But it'll be very unfair if we don't talk about how it even came into being, because those people never got anything to eat except blood, except feet, or the things which the higher caste would never sort of eat or touch. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating. Thank you very much, Prateek.
Thank you so much.
A round of applause for Prateek in the